All right. Hello and welcome to our lecture for American government about some of the established ideas and systems. Now, you've already looked at some of the influences from the philosophers and some of the locations, and we're going to continue that discussion. But in order to really understand their influence, you have to also understand some of these established ideas and systems. So let's go ahead and get into it. The first thing I want to talk about is the Declaration of Independence. So this is that document. You read it last year, so I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about it, but this is the document that actually established the independence, right? This is the colonists saying, hey, yo, King of England, you suck. Here's why we are free and independent states. Right. So some of the lines that I think are particularly important that may sound, and if they don't sound familiar, they should sound familiar since you read some of John Locke's writing. Some hints for you there. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Right? The idea that all people are created by God, therefore they're all equal, and that there are specific rights that each of these people have simply because they are created by God and they're all equal. Again, this should sound really familiar to you. The founding fathers who wrote these documents did not come up with these ideas on their own. Now, they took a lot of these ideas from different people in different places and put them together into a government really that had not existed before, a new government, right? But the individual ideas that we see here are not necessarily ideas from the founding fathers. So here's another example from the Declaration of Independence again, right? That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. I love this line, right? So in order for people to get these rights, to secure them, to protect them, right? People enter into societies in order to protect their property, to protect their possessions. Should sound familiar. So to protect these rights of people, governments are put in place among men and they get their power, meaning government gets their power from the consent of the governed, from the agreement of the governed. Governments get their power because the people who they are governing, the people they are ruling, agree to give them power. That's just like mind-boggling, right? It's so different than what we see, particularly with the monarchies of England, where God gives this king or queen power, therefore they have power. It has nothing to do with the people. Here, written in a document, it says, right, that the government has power because the people have agreed to give them power. And that's the only reason that the government actually has power. And they go on, so good, you guys, so good, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, so when they're destroying those ends, right, like they're no longer protecting the rights of the people, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. To alter, to change or abolish, get rid of it, the government. That's the it here, right? And institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. The people have the right to change the government, to get rid of the government and put a new government in place. Okay, again, these ideas are not brand new, but carried out in the way that they were was very different. Okay, another quote for you, right? Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, right? The founding fathers are saying, look, governments aren't just going to change willy-nilly. It's not going to be just because a few people are unhappy, but when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, a despot, right? That's somebody who has total power. It is their right, the people. It is the people's right. It is their duty, the people's duty, to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Again, these ideas should sound familiar. These ideas are radical and revolutionary, but they were not new, right? You read John Locke's writings. You've seen some of these ideas in his writings. This is a rewording of a lot of John Locke's ideas, really placed and wrapped up into the Declaration of Independence. Okay, so that's kind of the whole thing. We'll just continue on. All right, so after the Declaration of Independence, right? The Declaration of Independence was written once we were already at war with Great Britain. The American Revolution ends. America, with the help of France, is victorious, and now we actually have to create our government. If you remember, the first form of government that was created was under the Articles of Confederation. Tons and tons of weaknesses, didn't work out. The framers threw it away and created a new government under the Constitution. The Constitution ultimately creates a government with three branches of a three-branch system, right? So you have the legislative branch, and they have separation of powers, meaning they each kind of have each branch is separate and independent of each other, and they each have their own role. So the legislative branch, they make the laws, right? This is made up of Congress. Congress is made up, it's a bicameral system, if you remember from the Great Compromise, where we have the Senate, which is 2 representatives from each state, regardless of your population, right? The Senate, so there's 100 members. And then you have the House of Representatives, which is based on the population of your state. So there are 435 members in the House of Representatives. The more populous your state, meaning the more people who would live in there, the more representatives you have in the House. All of that makes up Congress. Those 2 branches of the Congress, right, those 2 houses, they make the laws. They come up with the laws, and then that's the role of the executive branch, the president and vice president and the presidential cabinet, to carry out the laws, to kind of enforce the laws. They have bureaus and government agencies within the executive branch who carry out the laws that are made by the legislative branch. They're separate and independent roles. So we see this separation of powers written into the Constitution, written into the creation of our government. And finally, the third branch is the judicial branch. This is the court system, and particularly the federal court system. So you have the Supreme Court, which is the top most ultimate power, and then underneath that you have other federal courts. All of these make up the judicial branch, and it's ultimately their responsibility to interpret the law. All right, so you have a branch that makes the law, a branch that carries out or executes the law, and then you have a branch that actually interprets the law. And they use the Constitution as kind of their foundation, right? Everything needs to go along with the Constitution. If a law is written that ends up being unconstitutional or is being carried out in a way that's unconstitutional, it's up to the judicial branch to decide that. Now, it's not just about separation of powers. The other thing that's really important that was built into our system was also checks and balances. So checks and balances, because of those separate and independent responsibilities or roles that each branch has, they also have ways to balance the power of the other branch. This is to ensure that no one person or no one branch becomes too powerful. So you can see in the image here, one of the ways that this happens is you see, so Congress is represented by that building in the upper right-hand corner. The Uncle Sam's hat represents the executive branch of the president, and then you have the judicial branch down here at the bottom. Okay, so you have Congress that, remember, they make the laws. All right, well, that law, the bill then goes to the desk of the president. Well, the president can actually veto the legislation. So the president can reject it and it will not actually become a law. So that's one way that the executive branch checks the power of the legislative branch. In addition, remember, the judicial branch can declare laws unconstitutional. So it's another way that even if a president approves a bill and it becomes a law, then the judicial branch can actually go, you know what, this really doesn't follow in step with or in line with the Constitution. In addition, the judicial branch can declare an act of the president as unconstitutional as well. Now, again, a way that executive branch has controls and kind of checks the power of the judicial branch is it's the role of the executive branch to actually nominate all judges for all federal courts. However, one of the things that's not on here, but the Senate has to approve those appointments. Right. In addition, the legislative branch can impeach the president. They can also impeach a justice of a federal court. So if a justice commits a crime, goes against the Constitution, they can be impeached, they can be removed from office. Same thing with the president. So you see that there's different ways that each of these different branches can kind of check the power of the other, just to make sure that no one branch or no one person becomes too powerful. And this system of checks and balances really works because of the separation of powers. So these separation of powers and checks and balances are kind of interwoven. But this was all part of the Constitution, and this is all written out in the Constitution. Now, there were some people who were not particularly happy with the Constitution. Primarily, we call them anti-federalists, right? So we have this federal system of government where there's a central government, and then each state has their own government as well. And the states also have rights, but nowhere in the Constitution are those rights laid out. Not only that, but nowhere in the Constitution does it say anything about the rights of the people. And so the anti-federalists were like, whoa, this is creating, the Constitution has created a government that is way too powerful. We just fought off England. We just fought off this tyrant of King George. We don't want a powerful government. And so they only agreed to ratify the Constitution, to accept the Constitution, to approve the Constitution, if some things were added. And so this becomes what we call the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights make up the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. As of the recording of this lecture, we have 27 amendments to the Constitution. So that means our Constitution has been amended or kind of fixed or added to 27 times. However, the first 10 were just to get it ratified. So really, it's only been 17 times since the Constitution was ratified that our Constitution has been amended. The first 10 amendments, as I mentioned, were called the Bill of Rights. And these were really laying out the rights of the people and the kind of protecting people against the government. The First Amendment alone is one that a lot of people know. It has 5 freedoms in it that become particularly important, right? And they're bolded here in this image. The freedom of speech, actually only 3 of them are there, are bolded, sorry. The freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, and the freedom of the press are the 3 that are bolded. But the First Amendment also includes the freedom to assemble and the freedom to petition. So you can petition your government, you can make a request of your government, you're also allowed to assemble, you're allowed to come together, right, for multiple reasons. But those 5 freedoms are for individual people, right? The freedom of the press becomes so important in order to have a democracy. We've read about that with Blackstone in particular, argues for the freedom of the press and how if we don't know what the government's doing, then the government can very easily become corrupt. And so the freedom of the press, it has to be an independent press, cannot be a press. It cannot be, reporters that are hired by the government. It has to be a free and independent press. There's lots of other amendments that we'll talk more about in detail as the semester goes on. But again, these are the first 10 amendments, the first 10 additions to the Constitution that make up the rights of the people and also really protecting the rights of the states, right? So you can see the 10th Amendment in particular. This amendment says that the powers that aren't guaranteed to the U.S. government they belong to the states, okay? And so, again, we see this protection of states' rights and individual people's rights as well with the Bill of Rights in order to ratify the Constitution. Now, just because the Constitution gets ratified or passed doesn't mean that it was all fabulous and everybody was so happy. In fact, in 1798, President John Adams is president. So he's the 2nd president of the United States. And it's during this time that some laws get passed called the Alien and Sedition Acts. Now, the alien part has to do primarily with immigrants and changing the laws to increasing, you have to live in the United States for, they changed it to 14 years in order to be able to vote as a new immigrant. But it's really the sedition part that becomes so problematic and controversial. It said government was allowed to fine, so charge people money, right? You could be fined or put in jail if any person shall write, print, utter, say, right, utter or publish any false, scandalous, and malicious writing or writings against the government of the United States or either House of the Congress or the President. So in 1798, it became illegal to say bad things about the president, to say bad things about the government. Now, one might argue that this goes directly against that First Amendment, right? And the freedom of speech or the freedom of press. However, when President Adams was president, he recognized that sometimes you have to go against your ideals in order to establish power and in order to establish something, right? And so he argued, like, we can't just keep sitting here talking over and over and over again about all the problems. We have to get something done. We have to get something put in place and something established in order to move forward. He argued that something was better than nothing, and all of this fighting and all of this arguing was making nothing happen. And so sometimes, right, you actually have to go against maybe your ideals or even your morals in order to be the leader that's necessary to get things moving. Okay. This law even went so far as to imprison the Vermont representative. I think it was Matthew Lyon was his name. He spoke out against President Adams. And so he was put in jail, and he actually got reelected from his jail cell for his position in Congress. But again, Adams firmly believed in this great experiment, as they called it, of America. But he really understood that leading this nation would require things that he may not agree with in order to establish power, in order to establish this country. So we see that these ideas from these different philosophers really do come into play. And again, it's not just the founding fathers were certainly radical and revolutionary and problematic historical figures. We talk all the time about history is really messy because people are messy. And so this is just kind of an example of some of the ways that of the messiness of it all and where these different ideas came from. So please make sure that you finish those structured notes. If you have any questions, feel free to visit me in office hours or email me. Thank you so much for listening and have a great day.